First of all, I'd just like to thank everyone involved in putting this amazing event together. I know how much work it takes. Just starting with Owsley and Sarah and everyone, thank you so much. It's such an opportunity for all of us to come together and open up some very important, very huge ideas. And I'd like to thank everyone here. And mostly, I think I'd like to thank all the panelists that have come before me, because they've made it extremely difficult to plan what I'm going to say. And I appreciate that, because what it means is I can't really rest in my own rightness, if I can make that a word. I can't rest on my assumptions. I can't hold on to views. That I'm always willing for these things to fall apart, and that's the beauty of interdependence. You know, that we influence each other, and that what we understand our life to be is this playful exchange of our inner and outer worlds. And I find that extremely exciting. So that somewhat speaks to the nature of interdependence. So what we're asked to do in the beginning here is to, I'm going to try to express to the best of my ability what interdependence means in the context of my own tradition, which is the Buddhist Mahayana tradition. And I think I will talk really about the essential, interdependence is really at the very essence of the Buddha's awakening and Buddhist teachings. So when the Buddha attained enlightenment, he talked about interdependence. Now, when I use this word enlightenment, I think it's a very lofty word, and other traditions might not understand what this means. So I want to bring it back to the human condition, because it's not something impossible or remote to who we are. In my new book that I wrote, The Logic of Faith, which I just finished, I decided to talk about faith as interdependence as living in grace. In other words, enlightenment is not something that happens in a vacuum, independent of everything else. Enlightenment has to do with who we are or how we understand ourselves in relationship to everything else. So not just to other people, but also to our inner world of, as we spoke of this morning, thoughts and emotions, and how we understand who we are in the midst of all of this. So I feel, well, we're in the South, I think we can say, and we always hear of, you know, how Southern, of graciousness in the South, and I really see that here in Louisville. I feel people are so extremely gracious. So I think we all understand grace. Grace is not necessarily just a religious word. Grace speaks to, for example, you know, when somebody walks into someone's home, if a person is attentive to what the other person needs. Are you thirsty? Are you hungry? Where would you like to sit? This is gracious. So this is a way we talk about grace, just in a very ordinary way. Or we can talk about grace in terms of physical movement. For example, if someone's dancing on a stage, you know, they have a sense of who they are in relationship to the space around them. They're very in tune with how their body works, how it moves, what they can do, how it's going to work. This is also grace. So the Buddha's enlightenment, what we call the Buddha's enlightenment, has a lot to do with the Buddha found himself in insane relationships with his world, his inner and outer worlds, the physical world, the world of people, the world of the environment. And so this would be a way, or this is a way that I've talked about enlightenment. It goes very deep, but this is really at the crux of it. So when the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, which is where he attained enlightenment. This was in Bodh Gaya, India. He had, I guess you could say, an awakening or epiphany. And he said something very interesting. And the way he described it, it's almost like a secret formula that unlocks the secret of the universe in some way. And this is what he said. You might be familiar with this, but he said, "This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. this not being, that becomes not. From the cessation of this, that ceases. So let me just say this again. This is very important, and don't worry, I'll open this up so it's very clear for you. So he says this being, that becomes. So for example, if the causes and conditions of suffering are there, then suffering will arise. If the causes and conditions of happiness are there, happiness will arise. And everything works like that. If there's a right, there's a left. If there's a good, there's a bad. Everything arises. Independence on other things is basically what this means. So then so from this being, that becomes, from the arising of this, that arises. And then this not being, that becomes not. If there are not causes and conditions for something to arise, like if you plant a seed and there's no good conditions, nothing will come of it. From the cessation of this, that ceases. So this is really the very heart of what the Buddha taught, because this is what he came to understand when he attained enlightenment. And this is part of absolutely every aspect of Buddhist thought and Buddhist practice. So basically, what we're talking about is relationship here. And I think what I'm going to do, well, before I do that, I just want to introduce some words to you. So what this is called, we call this interdependence. But in the context of the Buddhist teachings, the Sanskrit word for this is pratitya samutpada. I don't know if you're there when the rabbi was doing the meditation practice on the first morning, but he talked about this very word, which excited me very much. So in Sanskrit it's pratitya samutpada. Joanna Macy, the deep ecologist, calls it mutual causality or mutual reciprocity. It's also known as dependent arising or dependent origination. There are many other ways to talk about it. I tend to say that it's the nature when we understand that everything leans. Everything leans against each other, and this makes all this movement. It makes everything happen. If things didn't lean, nothing would move. Everything would be inert. So really, when you're talking about Genesis in the context of Buddhism, you're talking about the movement of interdependent relationships. That's why we say this is a non-theistic tradition. Everything is a constant state of movement. There's nothing that exists independent or as singular or as permanent or static. So let me do a demonstration for you so this doesn't remain in the realm of abstract thinking, because this becomes a very practical. So I hardly go anywhere without my 3 sticks. People who know me well, I've actually requested to my spiritual community that when I die, I would like to have my 3 sticks burnt with me. I have a really strong connection to this particular teachings. And one thing I like, because it's Earth Day today, it feels so good to hold something natural, and I find this very grounding. And I love that wherever I go, I collect the sticks of the trees of where I'm staying. And these 3 sticks I got from Christy Brown's gorgeous garden, and I like them. The sticks are different everywhere. It's so amazing. So what I'm about to point out, no pun intended, is that, well, let's see. So I'm holding up this stick, and I might need a little bit of audience participation. I can't see you so well, but call it out, okay? This can't happen just me alone. This is a group effort. So if I were to ask you, is this a big stick or a small stick, what would you say? Some people say big, some people say small. What else did I hear? Medium. Anything else? It depends. That's what I was looking for. And this is, by the way, this was a teaching that was talked about by a teacher named Chandrakirti, a great Indian master. I don't know if he used the sticks to illustrate it, but it's in his text. I want to point that out to feel connected to my lineage. Okay, so now I'm pointing out this stick, and I put it next to this stick. What does this stick become? It's bigger than this stick, right? Now if I hold up this stick, what happens to this stick? It becomes smaller. So let me ask you something. Does the size of this stick exist in the stick itself? It depends upon what it's next to. So you might say, well, you could say this stick is, I don't know, it's hard to measure, but 2.5 feet long. Is that intrinsic in the stick? No. Why? Because measurement is just a man-made contrivance. It's a fabrication and a very, very useful one. I want to say that size and measurement are extremely important and powerful. We've built cathedrals based on measurements. Our whole world is based on measurements and numbers. And it's similar with language. It's like, what is language but a series of sounds that we agree upon in order to communicate with each other and participate in the world in which we live. So when I say that this object has no objective size, it's not to undermine the fact that these agreements we have about things and the relationship things have between each other are not extremely profound and powerful. We all know how powerful language is. We all know how powerful this world of relativity is. So this sometimes gets confusing for people. When I was talking to Geshe Thupten Jinpa last night, and I was saying that I do this thing with the sticks, and he said that there was another teacher who did this, but she scared people. But it's scary because what this is saying is there's no intrinsic truth about anything. So maybe people often interpret that as, oh, well, maybe it doesn't matter then what you do, or the world of relativity kind of loses its potency. But that's not true at all. The relationships are powerful. That's the main point. So it doesn't have an intrinsic existence or truth. There is actually no reality in the fact that things don't exist in the object itself, which means you can never be right. Well, that's powerful. It all depends on where you stand. Because everything leans, this is the most extraordinary thing, personally, that I feel, means you always have to be in awe in one way or another. That you can't really know anything in a determinate, definitive way. And I often think that we look at awe as like some kind of luxury or something that comes upon us, but that it's not very practical. But I think awe is extremely practical and extremely important in the context of everything that we've talked about. First of all, if there's no awe, there can be fundamentalism. When there's awe, there can be no fundamentalism. I even think despair is kind of a form of fundamentalism. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be touched. We can't help but be touched by the sadness in the world, by other people suffering. We can't help that. But when you expose despair to a little bit of awe, I feel it turns into compassion. So we have this tendency to reify. We look at a situation and we say, for example, what do we do about North Korea? What do you do with a question like that? What do we do about animal cruelty or racism or all these different things that we've been talking about that are so significant, and we must respond to these things. But these are big abstract ideas, and within these big abstract ideas are all kinds of things are going on. North Korea is a big place with lots of people, and it all depends on where you stand and how you see it. So we have this tendency to reify. We reify each other when we only look at the color of a person's skin. Like when we're at our best, we don't do that. We really look at the human condition. We see some kind of inner beauty. We don't know. Like I was saying at lunch, that the greatest respect that we can have for anyone or anything is not to assume we know who they are. So I feel like this has a very practical place in the realm of activism, or maybe our ability to respond with intelligence to the world in which we live. In fact, one of the ways we talk about this, it's very interesting. We either think, oh, things exist and they're true, or else they're not true. We're very dualistic. There's a great teacher called Mipam Rinpoche who said, the way our minds are so dualistic, they're like an elephant. They roll in the mud. They roll in the water to rinse off the dirt, but then they have to roll in the dirt to dry off. We tend to see through a dualistic lens, but when you say everything leans, you can't say it's one and you can't say it's two. It's non-dual. And this is very powerful. This has been very powerful for me because I feel the world is really magical. And when I feel that I'm right, and things are stuck in their place, I'm also stuck in my place. It's actually the Buddha said that all the negative emotions arise from reifying things, from thinking we know what they are, whether we think they're bad or terrible, or we think they're good and perfect. Like to deify someone is very disrespectful because they can't be fully human. And to demonize someone is also disrespectful because we don't see all the causes and conditions for any one thing to happen. So, I remember, actually in my first book, I had these examples, and I still think they're such good examples for me when thinking about this, how negativity arises from reification, making something real. Real doesn't mean you don't experience it here. Real means that the thing exists in the object. You get that, right? So, for example, during World War I read a statistic that they did this survey. They asked the veterans whether they would rather shoot or be shot at. And most of them, the large percentage of them said that they would rather be shot than shoot someone else. And of course, the military got wind of this and they didn't like it. So they started to invent new tactics to indoctrinate the veterans, making them reify or objectify the enemy. After Vietnam, the statistics switched. They said they would rather shoot than be shot at, which is so saddening and alarming. So it shows that to look at someone in a one-dimensional way as the enemy means that we can't see the multidimensionality of who they are. So when I say multidimensionality, I mean we can't say that anyone is one singular thing. In the world of interdependent relationship, for example, if you were to look in the eyes of your enemy and say, oh, there's somebody's father, there's somebody's son, there's somebody's brother, they're human, they feel things. It's going to be harder to be aggressive. That's why reification is seen as the root of all the negative emotions. This being that becomes, to reify creates the condition for negativity and a lack of compassion. And you can say the same thing, for example, with attachment. For example, the advertising industry understands reification. So when they advertise, they show you the one-dimensionality of an object. Oh, here's this fantastic car. Look at how the commercials are. The sun is glimmering on the roof, and it's winding around the roads, taking the curves and all that. But when you start to think of parking tickets, insurance, how the engine breaks down and the dashboard cracks, you might still buy the car, but you have much less of that graspy feeling. You have much more of a realistic idea of what that is. So this notion of open dimensionality, of looking at things with this kind of this is what interdependence does. The purpose of interdependence in this tradition is to penetrate that sense of truth and realness. And I do hope that I think we're going to talk about this. Did I do my time? Okay. We can open this up more, but I feel I do want to talk about the practical nature of awe, and I do want to talk about how important it is to use interdependence as a tool to open ourselves out of this sense of thinking we know who something is or what a situation is. Even here on Earth Day, when we fall into despair and we get angry at the state of the world or the state of our government or anything in particular, to understand that it all depends on how you look at it. It depends on the moment. There's causes and conditions that give rise to all things and so forth. And so that's how it functions in this particular tradition. So.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think the fact that there are many faith traditions represented here, and my pathway is not the same as yours, makes this conversation really important. And what you brought, the constantly changing nature of everything, the relativity of things, this question about applied to the theme of this conference, compassion, which implies suffering, and even maybe the relativity of suffering. I think a rich conversation can come from that, which we can explore afterwards. But maybe, Marc, you could comment on what's already been said and give us your thoughts, and then we'll go into an exchange.
Oh, okay. Well, I know Elizabeth and I and Patrick are actually really dear friends, and I love your use of the sticks, and I can tell you that Elizabeth is a person who walks softly and carries a relatively large stick. It depends, it depends. Thank you for that. But I love the interplay. The Buddhist teaching on interdependence has been very helpful to me. As I'll say when I speak in just a moment.
You can speak now.
Well, I will. I am. The West is recovering a sense of what inner being means, and Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, has given us a very fleshed out, really beautiful set of teachings, interlocking teachings on dependent co-arising, on emptiness, and on interdependence itself. And I have benefited so much from that and have yet so much more to learn from it. So I want to thank you for that.